Mark Selby, week 18. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Matthew. Have we sort of got the nickel cathode rotating intro movie clip now that we're getting this many weeks into it? I think we're going to need some,
That'd be so
like
cool. I say so cool. It'd be kind of 1980s cool. Have that thing going on. We could look into it, but don't expect a phone call. So we thought it'd be a quiet week this week, right? So with the Chinese National Golden Week, right?
Yep.
Nothing happens in China. Everyone's partying like crazy. But
they don't have.
You're going to tell me something different.
Yeah. No. What's interesting is again, nickel, never a dull metal. Nickel all of a sudden sort of broken out. It's up 3 or 4%. It's up 2% here as we speak today. And, again, on its own without the rest of the base metals moving. So it's not a momentum play at all. One thing that sometimes happens in these quiet periods, back in the before time where China dominated the market in the 2000s, what was interesting is commodity hedge funds would take advantage of the Christmas quiet period to kind of give the market a shove in an opposite direction. So, if the market was long, thinking, prices were quite high and people thought prices were going to fall, you'd see some of the hedge funds try and short the market while there's there's much less liquidity and cause the market to drop, and vice versa. If the market was prices were low and people thought prices were going to move higher the next year, they would take advantage of that little shove. So, it's tough to read data into 48 hours of data. But again, reminding people, we've talked about this triangle of, nickel ore supply from the Philippines, Chinese demand, and Indonesian NPI. And so, we are now in the rainy season in the Philippines. We're going to start to see ore supply shrink dramatically. And, Chinese demand, as we've talked about the last few shows, has remained relatively high. So, maybe there's some data that hasn't been widely disseminated yet, and some people positioning in front. So, when you see some moves in this quiet week, it will be interesting to see what happens next week. So
that's why I like doing these macro conversations with people to understand the market, because there are times of the year in different commodities where players try and affect change. Right, we know this. I'm thinking of gold, India. There's certain times of the year where there's a kind of big rush on gold. That's when you go and buy your gold. But if you don't know about these things, you don't make allowances for these things. And equally, little things like if you're investing in Canadian stock, basically in tax season, which is something I wasn't aware of until I started investing in the junior space in Canada, that the market behaves a certain way. So it's important to understand these little games. So someone coming in and maybe giving the price a shove, whether they're expecting it to be long or short in the following year over that Christmas period. That's fascinating to me. I like that. That's a good bit of knowledge. I didn't know.
Yeah, no, and again too for investors, in terms of short-term trading, there's an entire banking firm in Scandinavia called Crux Plateau. And part of the reason they went into mining and metals is because they used to be, they were one of the world's biggest ship brokers. So they literally knew where every single ship was in the world and what it was carrying. So they realized, hey, for things like all the bulk commodities like iron ore and coal and so forth, they had a massive amount of market intelligence in terms of what those product flows look like. And so, in terms of, how commodity prices were moving, they had a huge advantage. And again, don't underestimate, there are big commodity hedge funds. They're more in China now than they are in the West. But, they'll have satellite pictures. They will know exactly, as much as I'm talking about Philippines ore imports sort of after the fact, and they've been reported for this week. There's lots of people who already know, how many ships showed up in a port this week, and from the comparison of the satellite pictures of various stockpiles, know sort of, what's been going on with those stockpiles. So again, if you're prepared to bet against those people, go for it, but just be careful about short-term trading if you don't have.
That's fascinating. We interviewed one of our club members a couple of weeks ago, actually now, and his job is to analyze photos, satellite imagery and basically sell these services into, he gave us sort of a number of examples of what was going on, but I thought it was fascinating that this data is used to make decisions. I think the examples he gave were, quite wholesome in terms of, how they were using it, but equally, it's a little bit futuristic, or seems a bit futuristic, to be using live satellite data to actually, place your bets. But of course they are. So how can us punters ever hope to win? We're going to need to buy our own satellite, Mark.
Exactly. Well, it's better to trade a little more fundamentally, unless you're prepared to really sort of get dated up, to really have enough data to do it in a proper way. So.
Okay, well, let's stick with what we know. So
there we go.
Nickel price broke back up, 660, looking good.
Yeah.
Is that sustainable, or is this just a little bump in the road?
Oh no! Again, I think it's just sort of someone looking maybe to position themselves coming out of this holiday week. I think it is a good portend for next week. And the other part too is we've seen stainless demand stay relatively strong. We don't think it's getting any stronger, but it's going to stay relatively strong. And as we talked about last time, ore prices are at multi-year highs. So that's your downside risk in the nickel price right now is relatively low through this rainy, unless it's going to dry up. Philippines have a super dry season. Through this next 4 months, your downside risk should be relatively low, and your risks are much more to the upside.
Okay. And you only need a weather app for that. Don't need a satellite to actually see what the weather's doing in the Philippines at the moment. So we've got some good understanding.
Yes. Yes. The absolute reliability weather forecast. The key thing is we have a La Nina event. So again, La Nina also has sort of very definitive, the reason California is on fire is because we're in a La Nina event right now. So I will check for next week to see what a La Nina event means in terms of the intensity of the rainy season in the Philippines. So
good. I need that fundamental data with a $3.99 app. Right. So it's a more serious section now, which is announcement from Tsingshan around. It's an ESG matter, and we've talked about this on and off of the past few weeks, and certainly with some of the other commodities out there, it's becoming more and more important. But they've made a big call recently. Do you want to tell us about that? Yeah,
so we've sort of talked about dirty nickel, on the show for a year or so, and much more in depth over the last several months. We pushed quite hard in terms of our net zero approach with Canada Nickel, and sort of highlighted, some of those, key issues. And again, it Tesla also started talking about them, so they may have had a little more media impact than we did. But I think we were out on a few channels like Bloomberg and some other news services that picked up the story. So then all of a sudden you started to see a real series of stories around this deep sea tailings discharge. And now this week, early at the beginning of the week, Tsingshan announced that they were not going to do deep sea tailings for their HPAL project. And then, there was a story out yesterday that there's 3 HPAL plants that are, under consideration in various stages of construction, and all 3 projects now have abandoned, deep sea tailings approach, which is great for the marine environment.
It's fantastic. And 2 points there. One, because I think we had Conic on with Anthony Maluski. Topical Anthony Maluski at the moment. They had, one of their projects had a bit of an issue. It was getting a lot of bad publicity about some tailings, deep sea tailings going on, and I think there was also some leaks as well, because it was colouring up at surface, a lot of dead marine life, etc. And I think they were trying to deal with that at the time. So it's a significant focus at the moment in that part of the world for sure. But the second thing, which is important here, is it changes the capex considerably for them.
Yeah. Oh no. That's the key here is, there is a reason they were doing that as their sort of preferred option. It's, sticking a pipe down to a certain depth in the ocean, with the theory being that once you get it down to a certain depth, it won't make its way back up to, anywhere where people, where creatures live. And the issue with Ramu in Papua New Guinea showed that, okay, that's not always the case, and that they got caught up with some upwelling and ended up, causing some issues there. What you need to look at now is basically a land-based tailings option, and so the reason they didn't go to that immediately is a few reasons, and are going to it's going to require some engineering to really make it happen. One is the residue from an HPAL plant, it's been ground up very fine, and it's basically sort of in semi-suspension in liquid, and it doesn't always settle out very well. So the liquids and solids separating. So it's difficult to stack up, into behind a great big tailings dam, because it just doesn't settle out, particularly well. The second thing is, where Sulawesi, where the nickel deposits are in Sulawesi, is in a highly seismic area. Again, we talked about that to get a nickel deposit to form, and the reason why nickel only shows up in certain areas is you need to open up, you have an opening big enough to get down into the mantle, to be able to do it. So there's some, a number of faults right nearby the island of Sulawesi, and it does shake. I watched some movies in my first year geology class that shows what happens with you. There's something called quick clay, which is basically very fine particles, semi-suspended in liquid. It looks like a soil, but when you shake it, it liquefies, and with the extreme consequences. And I think there was an incident in Scandinavia a few years ago where that happened. You saw an entire piece of the shoreline just suddenly gave way. So those kind of images and those kind of engineering challenges, are fundamental. One of the other things that's been thrown out is dry stack tailings. Well, dry stack tailings are great if you're in the desert somewhere. I'm not sure, in a place that has a monsoon season, how the dry stack stays dry during the monsoon. And as an example, Goro was using land-based tailings. They had to build a lined facility. And part of the reason this shutdown is happening around now is they were looking at a $400 million cost to build a engineered lined storage facility to be able to store these tailings. So I am not sure what those options are going to look like for Indonesia, but it's going to increase the capital cost of these operations and increase the operating costs. So stay tuned on that front.
So Goro, to do that, we're spending $400 million to build something fully engineered solution. Okay, and we've seen this as well in some of the investments I've made in a previous life, banking days, where you'd have these fully engineered solutions, and we've seen plants completely underwater that had been engineered not to be. We've seen storage and tailings facilities which are meant to be, fully engineered, meant to be waterproof, and you're looking at sort of tarpaulins with tires on them in most cases, because the best laid plans of mice and men, but it caused hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage, and to the bank I was working with at the time, because what people say and what people do are very different things, and especially in countries like this, where perhaps the operational side of things are not quite operational, I should say.
Oh, yeah. And again, too, when you build a tailings dam, you're building something to hold something back.
Yeah.
And again, in a monsoon climate where you might get several, inches of rain, or, a meter of rain in a few weeks, to have all that water then sitting behind, this dam, can be highly problematic. So
I mean,
sadly seen in a few places.
Oh, definitely seen this in a few places. So if I'm looking at this as if this is the new norm, people saying we are not going to do deep sea tailings, we're going to do dry stack wherever. The jurisdiction everywhere has its own problems. Like Canada, you guys, you've got a lot of snow. The snow melts. You're gonna have to deal with that. You've got Brazil or South America. You're very wet seasons indeed, and obviously with the incident with Vale of whatever 3 years ago now, I guess. Everywhere's got their own problems and their own costs associated with maintaining the best processes. But that's what investors are demanding, or certainly what sort of the big institutional investors are being demanded of them before they make these investments, isn't it? So does the cost of mining go up as a result? Is that the new norm?
Well, I think, again, the cost of mining, if you have to retrofit it in terms of your plans, then certainly that's additional cost. The opportunities are, to be able to pick those projects and get into them at an early enough stage that, one, they're inherently easier to do the right thing. And two, you can design the right thing in initially with, and again, generally, if you're able to design it in at the beginning, it tends to be, you can do it in a way that perhaps this, the same cost or in some cases even lower cost. So, again, with Canada Nickel, with our Crawford project, the fact that, our waste rock and tailings absorb CO2 and we've got access to hydroelectricity, which avoids, again, the big issue with the Indonesian CO2 footprint is the fact that they have to burn 25 or 30 tons of coal to make a ton of nickel, right? And we just don't have that kind of an issue. So again, as you see mining companies now and the big companies look to design asset portfolios that are inherently lower carbon, that thinking is really going to start to work into their evaluation in terms of, okay, can we do it in a way that's low carbon? Can we do it in a way that's is even more sustainable, environmentally sustainable than we were doing 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
Okay. Something which has sort of come up again, it's been very topical for the last, few weeks, is Tesla, right? So, we talked last week, we said, the first rule of Tesla Club is don't talk about Tesla Club, right?
Yeah.
But everyone's talking about Tesla. So we've got Tesla and Vale and Tesla and BHP. And these seem to make a lot of sense because these are big players and Tesla's a big player. Why wouldn't they? But why announce it?
My mom phoned me this week too. She's talking with Tesla as well.
I'm glad. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
No, I mean, again, at the big company level, Tesla's battery day, last week, which we talked about, 3 terawatts of battery production. That's what they said they want to produce by 2030. Again, various estimates, if you, and again, this is assuming that, there's going to be a bunch of batteries that have 0 nickel in them. But that production will need 1 to 1.5 million tons of nickel, and in a 2.5 million ton market today. So, BHP produces, I think, 70,000 tons of nickel. Vale in Canada produces about 50,000. With Voisey's Bay, about 80 to 90,000 tons of nickel. So yes, that, Tesla will be talking to all of them to try and get as much nickel as they can, as cheaply as they can, for the next decade. Because, those are, again, it's not like there's 74 companies they can go call and get nickel. It's a fairly short list. So, if Tesla wasn't talking to BHP or talking to Vale, that would be more of a story. But hey, you know what? That's the story du jour.
It is the story du jour. It's basically saying Tesla's talking to everyone all the time about all the commodities because they need to know where it's coming from. And so if we do read more stories, which I suspect we will, of Tesla talking to people, take it with a pinch of salt. Okay, got it.
Yeah, because they're talking to everybody.
They're talking to everybody. Just want to look at some of the. So we talked about what's happening in the Philippines and China, etc. But I guess the news that I saw recently was New Caledonia. They had an independence vote. Right, and that's been and gone. So that says surely there's some. We know what the outcome is. There's stability, no future issues. What does it say to you?
Yeah, yes, exactly. No, again, one of the things that I encourage investors to do is, political risk is very real. Jurisdiction risk is very real. So, again, in terms of projects that are in countries, typically when a region or a country is holding an independence vote, it implies that there are a certain group of people that are not happy. Generally, they have not, and usually to get to that point, it doesn't mean that they've been sitting quietly. quietly phoning their, MPs to say, please, allow us to have a vote. There's, tends to be a whole pile of actions that happen as part of that. So, at the end of the day, when you look at, okay, why has New Caledonia, you've seen literally $20 to $30 billion of investment pour in between Koniambo and Goro. It's a very complicated political jurisdiction as a sort of a colony of, or semi-colony or semi-independent part of France, and the tensions in those relationships and the tensions between different groups of people who live there. It just makes things makes everything more complicated.
Yeah, you heard about our Brexit vote, right? Everyone's trying to be independent.
Yeah, I think I've heard of that. That was good for the UK economy and good for UK business, I heard. So.
Absolutely crushed us. It was. I've forgotten how bad that was because of the whole COVID thing. Then someone earlier this week reminded me how bad that was for business. And by the way, still not resolved. And this is a first world economy. Right, I'm not sort of saying that New Caledonia is not sophisticated, but you're right. It brings to the front that because our vote here Brexit was 52 to 48%, right? It was that close. And
and the independence vote was that close, and they voted to stay, but it was that close.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it causes problems for sure, and at best it slows things down considerably.
Right.
That's the problem, and it makes things for me as a bank. If I we've looked at multiple jurisdictions around the world, that makes me nervous. We've definitely not invested in countries where it's been that close, or where. It says the results should say everything, but it doesn't say everything. It's what, as you just pointed out, the underlying facts are. It suggests unrest in the country, and that puts your investment at risk. So it was a good point to bring up. And the other component here is I want to talk to you about European stainless. Anti-dumping duties as well, because again, that's a kind of knock-on effect from what we've just discussed, right? What's happening there?
So again, Tsingshan, did a flawless job with the building of their massive integrated nickel pig iron stainless steel plant in Indonesia. Again, just on time, it's close to on budget as we've seen in terms of budget numbers and so forth. But there was one small problem is they, because they were producing some very low cost stainless steel, the issue is then you have a bunch of entrenched competitors all over the world who say, okay, there's, some sort of unfair advantage that they're getting, or they will argue that there's some sort of unfair advantage to try and deny you market access to their market. So, so shortly after Tsingshan started to ramp up their stainless steel plant, and those stainless steel started showing up in various markets, pretty much every jurisdiction, put up anti-dumping duties, and you're having a bad day when your quote home country, China itself, the state-run stainless steel maker who couldn't compete with privately owned Tsingshan, lobbied the Chinese government to put anti-dumping duties on stainless steel from Indonesia. So the Europeans now, I think, are also sort of looking to sort of expand that. And they mentioned Indonesia, and I don't know for sure, but I think probably what they're trying to do is, to take a situation where perhaps you take sort of a stainless steel slab and you maybe do a few steps on it in India, so that it becomes an Indian product. And that way you get around the, if there's a direct export duties on Indonesia, then you convert it into an Indian product, and away you go. So the fact that they've named both of those in this current round of anti-dumping duties suggests that they're trying to shut a back door there as well. And the other thing that's happened on the Indonesian front is there's been some legislation promoted in terms of sort of with worker regulation and environmental protections to try and in the guise of trying to get more foreign Chinese investment into the industrial sector as Chinese industry sort of decamps out of higher cost China and is now looking for lower cost places to operate. They want to try and get as much of that. So there's been strikes and a bunch of protests in Indonesia around that. There's been some strikes at some of the NPI production sites as well around worker conditions and so forth. So, stay tuned. I mean, that's the the danger as as workers start to climb up the productivity curve and start to climb up, then they actually start wanting some worker protections and safety rights and so on and so forth. So, we'll see how that plays out in Indonesia over the next couple of years here as well.
Two fantastic points there. I mean, the anti-dumping component, we've just seen that in the uranium space as well. It was really between US and Russia, but there's lots of other players in here too who are sort of, dumping product into the marketplace. So the US looking to tighten up and kind of level the playing field somewhat. Not sure how good a job they did, but it's a start. But with all of these things, it's just paperwork. There's some clever guys out there who'll find a workaround, and then that'll need to be updated, and then there'll be another workaround. And it's a game. It's a game that's long been played and is well understood. And the workarounds are political to win votes. The workarounds are by the industrialists who find solutions to problems like that. So I do like that. But the bigger one here is around workers' rights. Again, that's been around a long time. Different countries have evolved at different rates, and as money pours in, as people get educated, as the cost of living goes up and salaries go up and so forth, the expectations change, and the masses, quite rightly, are standing up for themselves, and but that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of cost, of course. Nothing wrong with that, but again, it's well understood, well-trodden road ahead. I'm interested to see how quickly that takes effect.
Yeah, it's something that's come up in the last 12 months or so. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how much momentum that gets in Asia. Now, the other thing you brought up was the U.S. government. What was the other sort of jaw-dropping news this week was the U.S. government made a $25 million investment into a private company called TechMet, which has several nickel cobalt assets, a nickel cobalt recycling company, and then a leach project in Brazil called Piauí. Vale used to have two laterite projects that they wanted to look at doing leaching on. One was Vermelho, which is owned now by Horizonte. And then Piauí was the other one that they spent a bunch of time and money in the 2000s advancing. And now TechMet is looking at using a heap leach process on nickel materials. Again, we need innovation. There has to be another way other than doing pressure acid leach on these processes, because again, in most instances, other than by Sumitomo Metal Mining, hasn't worked out so well. So, but the challenge is, if it was easy to do, somebody would have done it sooner. And there's a long laundry list of various nickel processing technologies that haven't quite lived up to the promise. So we'll see. Again, fingers crossed that maybe they can crack that nut, but we'll see what happens. But again, in terms of reinforcing that the U.S., I think we talked last time about, there's a few things that in the U.S. that have true bipartisan support, both from the Democrats and the Republicans. But sourcing of strategic minerals is something that both parties get behind 100%. And the fact that the U.S. government's writing a check to somebody was pretty profound.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about this one because the British government has done the same thing with around SMRs with Rolls-Royce. Yep. They're putting the money in. And I think they've always put their money in. And the US government has always put money into these things. But the mood at the moment in the market is around this nationalism, around protectionism, around critical mineral lists, which every country has and has had for a long time, right? But I think the mood in the market is around, because of this kind of nationalism, this underlying tone of America first, or is that the America first? UK, we've had the same thing, and across Europe, you're seeing this rhetoric and tone of conversation going on. Do you think we're just noticing it more because of this environment, or has it always been there, or are governments actually stepping up to the plate and investing more than they did before? Because again, I've been involved in a lot of government projects, and I can tell you that we've been involved in some big numbers because the government wants to control the relationship with different countries. The French did a lot across Africa, and East Asia as well. The US has always been involved in one way or another. So I'm not sure right now if I think that this is a new thing or not, or whether we're just noticing it more.
No, it is. I would say it is a new thing. I would say, just using the U.S. as an example. So, through the 80s, well, all the way up until the year 2000, they had a strategic metal stockpile. So they literally had piles of various metals, nickel in one of them, and they through the 90s and 2000s basically started selling them off because we don't need to worry about worry about that anymore. Then I think what's been driving it is, again, you see in a whole pile of materials since from 2000 to 2020, you now see China owning either directly 60, 70, 80, in some cases 90+% of critical parts or entire parts of the supply chain for certain materials. And now with the rhetoric ratcheting up between China and the US, it makes sense to have certain if you're sort of positioning this other country now as your enemy, which is both countries are doing to some extent, well, maybe one more than the other, then to me the strategic sourcing is a natural fallout of that kind of positioning. And so, it is new. And I can tell you again, I've been contacted with Canada Nickel in terms of, again, there's now people in the U.S. sort of trade service as part of the U.S. U.S. Foreign Service has one of their mandates is obviously go reach out on these list of minerals and go talk to people in friendly countries about what they can do to help. So and it was a very credible, very positive, and very helpful discussion. So it is different.
Okay. I guess my experience is more African based from that regard, where operate in 25 countries across Africa, and obviously very mineral rich countries there, and you've got different players. Like I think remember one country, 7 different countries after the same resource from a government level. Not right. They weren't there to support companies from their country. They were there as a government talking. And I'm talking 10 years ago, 9 years ago, right?
Yeah.
That sort of period of time, and it was definitely. And I was set in Morocco in various places in Rabat, meeting ministers and congressmen, etc., and presidents and prime ministers of various countries from around who would gather in Rabat to have these conversations. But it kind of felt like carving up Africa again in a way. It was kind of strange, but it was because these countries didn't have enough money, and they knew you could walk in and basically option or buy up certain minerals really, really cheaply, because these countries needed hospitals and roads and food and energy and basic stuff like this that was giving away. I think maybe a bit less so. Maybe it just was an African thing, but I'm just conscious of those and the memories of those conversations happening a bit more overtly back then than I've seen since. But now, obviously, when the US government does it, I guess openly, not behind closed doors where we were, I guess people are taking note, because it's not a big sum of money. It's like nothing.
No, for the U.S. government, it's not much. And again, again, where the U.S. government wants to sort of protect their interest, they do get involved. So, part of the reason the U.S. is a global leader in innovation in a number of fields is that you have U.S. Defense Department initiatives and other related agencies, that basically are providing huge amounts of early stage risk capital for people to explore new technologies to use for the military, which then also end up, sometimes having civilian applications as well. So, so again, once it becomes a critical priority, then having a little bit of sprinkling of the hundreds of billions, if not low trillions of dollars that ends up, in that part of the economy. Again, you don't need much to sort of splash over into the mining sector here to have a significant impact. So
it's true. Okay. Well, I guess more stories like this will pan out over the next few weeks and months. As I think generally, I don't know how you're feeling, but generally most CEOs in the mining space seem very buoyant at the moment. They're expecting at least 2 or 3 years of this. make hay while the sun shines. I mean, obviously, you nickel guys have had a great time of it the last few months as well.
Yeah, no, China's priming the pump. So you in the U.S. you don't fight the Fed, and in China you don't fight the Chinese central bank. If they want to get the economy moving in a certain direction, they will get it there. So,
right, okay, food for thought. Great conversation in a quiet week.
Thank you, sir.
I loved it. Some big meaty topics on there. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you next week.
All right, sounds good. Cut to the spinning nickel cathode closeout sequence. There we go.
I might have to get like a paper mache board and just paint it. It's something for the kids to do this weekend, spinning somewhere. Okay,
there we go.
Big budget.
Right.
Big budget. See you next week, Mark. Cheers. Bye.
All right, thanks, Matthew. Take care.